Since February, over 12 lakh Indians have streamed home from the Gulf as instability continues in New Delhi's neighborhood. This has been a recurring feature of the past century. In 1990, 2011, 2014, and 2015, among other occasions, tens of thousands of Indians have been evacuated and brought home when at risk during the Gulf War, the Arab Spring, the rise of ISIS, and other regional upheavals. India's largest diaspora, which is over 9 million people, lives in the Gulf and has always lived in this paradox. Indians are indispensable to the economies that host them, but are periodically reminded that our presence there is conditional. From the buffalo herders who built one of the world's greatest medieval ports, to the Jat governor of Egypt, to academics translating Sanskrit works and enslaved women trafficked for profit, here is one part of the history of Indians in the Arab world. The history of the Indian diaspora extends much further back than one might expect. From as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, we know of traders from Meluha or the Harappan civilization who lived and traded in present day Iraq and Oman. In an earlier edition of Thinking Medieval, we discussed a 17th century Bania diaspora that lived in major Gulf cities such as Bandar Abbas. Of course, what we think of as Indian wasn't necessarily what medieval people thought of as Indian. A group known as the Zutt, or the Arabic rendition of Jat, offers some insight. Now, many tales are told of these Zutt and how they arrived in the Gulf. According to historian Christina Richardson in Roma in the Medieval Islamic World, an apocryphal tradition claims that Behram Gur, the Sasanian king of Iran, wrote to the king of India asking for musicians. What he received, according to Arabic chroniclers, was a tribe of between 10,000 and 12,000 Zutt, relocated with their camels and buffalo herds from the Indus Delta and Makran drylands to the marshlands of southern Iraq. A canal known even today as the Nahr al-Zat may have been established for them. Historian Andre Wink in Al-Hind, The Making of the Indo-Islamic World, adds some context to this legend. Behram Gur established several settlements across the Gulf, crewed with mercenaries to contain piracy. As a nomadic and pastoral people, the Zat may have been ideal caravan guards. Now, over the next century, Zat tribes from the Indus area gradually spread along the Gulf. In Sassanid soldiers in early Muslim society, historian Mohsen Zaveri notes that some Zat spoke Farsi and considered themselves to be Persians, even serving in Sasanian military units. But the Arab conquest that erupted throughout the region in the 7th century eradicated Sasanian power and brought several important changes. For one, the Zat, along with another group who were possibly Malays called the Sayabija, were formally settled in the port of Basra, where they guarded caravans and took part reluctantly in the vendettas of Arab tribes. The Umayyad caliphs, who consolidated authority in the 8th century, deported 27,000 Zat to present-day Syria on their border with the Byzantine Empire. They not only combated bandits but also a plague of lions. Another major influx of Zat arrived in Iraq after the Arab conquest of Sindh, though their living conditions remained miserable. A serious rebellion ensued, threatening trade routes and the authority of the Abbasid caliphs, perhaps best known in India today for commissioning translations from Sanskrit into Arabic. In 834 CE, after a rebellion that had seriously disrupted Abbasid authority in southern Iraq, another 27,000 Zat were marched to the Byzantine border and many others were massacred. A Zat song recorded by the medieval Arab chronicler Al-Tabari curses the people of Baghdad for their reliance on luxurious dates, Chinese silk, and gold brocade. Al-Jahiz of Basra, the greatest prose stylist of the Abbasid age, was a contemporary of these deportations. In his Book of Animals, he cites an authority who describes the Zat with contempt as, and I quote, mosquitoes flying on the back of the bull, then they dipped the proboscis into the hide of the buffalo. End quote. In fact, the Zat's connection to India was so distant that in Arab sources, aside from markers of otherness such as their distinctive clothes and cross-shaped hairstyles, writers seemed to be completely unaware of their Indian origins. Ironically, the same Al-Jahiz in his essay The Superiority of Blacks to Whites defends East African slaves or Zanj against Arab disdain, using Indians for a central argument. In the voice of these slaves, he writes, and I quote, "We would reply by asking you whether, among all the captives brought from India and Sindh, you have ever found one that had the slightest hint of intellect, manners, culture, and education. If you have not, then why would you expect to find these qualities among East African slaves?" End quote. Al-Jahiz then lists what he considers to be self-evident in the refined culture of Arabic literati, a view supported by several Abbasid works such as the Book of the Wonders of India. He argues that Indians are preeminent in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, sculpture, and chess, and that India gave the world the Panchatantra. So how is it, he asked, that despite the many captives brought from India, none displayed these qualities? His answer is that captives come from the margins of society, from shores, swamps, jungles, and islands, from hired hands and fishermen. The enslaved cannot be judged by the standards of the societies that enslaved them. Now, that's a pretty sophisticated argument, and Al-Jahiz deploys it to make a point about Arab attitudes to Zanjis. In fact, in the 860s, mere decades after the Zutt rebellions, Zanj slaves had also risen up around Basra only to be violently suppressed. But reading against the grain, we can see that for elite Arabs like Al-Jahiz, elite Indians served as a benchmark of civilizational achievement. At the same time, ordinary Indian captives seem to have been pretty unremarkable in Abbasid cities, sourced from Sindh, from traders within India, and from subjugated populations like the Zutt. Al-Jahiz's sophistication is doubly ironic because, as a product of his times, he also wrote extensively about enslaved Indian women. In her essay, Slaves for Pleasure and Arabic Sex and Slave Purchase Manuals from the 10th to the 12th centuries, historian Pernilla Mirn cites him, quote, "Know that there is abundant happiness and complete pleasure only in the brood of two dissimilar kinds, the mating of an Indian woman with a Khurasanian man. They will give birth to pure gold." End quote. Such ideas likely shaped practices in the Abbasid slave markets, as slavery was very much part of the medieval economy. In fact, the slave purchase manuals that Mern examines confirm that Indian and Sindhi women were categorized and ranked alongside Zanj, Berbers, Turks, and Byzantines. Generally, Byzantine and Turk slaves were considered high quality, Sindhis medium, and Indians low grade. A different class of Indians was also present in the region, having arrived through far more comfortable means for highly skilled work. As with the Zutt, this too had pre-Arab precedent. The Academy of Jundeshapur, founded in 260 CE by Shapur I in Khuzestan, where the Zutt had grazed their herd from the 5th century onwards, was, by the 6th century, the most sophisticated medical institution in West Asia. According to historian Mehmed Mehfuz Soilemez, in the Jundeshapur school, its history, structure, and functions, an Indian community had settled there by this time. Hindu and Buddhist Indians studied alongside Nestorian Christians and Mazdakite Iranians in what Soilemez describes as an institution that could compete with modern institutions of education in its tolerance of different backgrounds. Among these scholars was Manka, who in the early 9th century translated Sanskrit medical texts into Pahlavi at Jundeshapur and produced the Kitab al-Sumum, the Book of Poisons. This book was originally attributed to Shanak, believed by some scholars to be Chanakya. Manka later gained patronage under Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who summoned him to Baghdad at the request of the Barmakid family, whose members themselves were Buddhists from bulk who had converted to Islam. In Baghdad, Manka translated Shushruta's surgical texts into Arabic for Khalid Barmakid. His translations were widely used by Jundeshapur's doctors and professors, and they circulated in the hospitals of Baghdad for decades after. But beyond scattered references in medieval bibliographies, we know very little about this life of this forgotten Indian man. Now, far away from Baghdad, in 9th century Egypt was a troubled frontier for the Abbasid caliphs. Rebellion, factionalism, and weak governance made it difficult for the caliphs to extract any wealth from the province. This began to change with the arrival of Al-Sari ibn al-Hakam al-Zati, which is to say, Al-Sari, son of Al-Hakam, the Jat. When he arrived, according to the Cambridge History of Egypt, he was a man of no importance. But he gradually carved out a dominion from Fustat to Aswan, playing Abbasid princes against each other. In 819, he publicly drowned a group of his enemies in the Nile. After his death in 822, his son negotiated a surrender of the province in exchange for 10,000 dirhams and a palace in Samarra. And so, in the 9th century Gulf, Indian diasporas existed simultaneously within the same empire, sometimes in the same cities. Those who navigated state upheavals like Al-Sari retired in splendor as part of the Gulf elite. Those with specialized skills like Manka were esteemed and influential and wrote works that circulated in the hospitals of Baghdad for decades. And those without either of those, like the thousands of Zutt, were displaced, exploited, and erased. In all of this, the Indians of the medieval world mirror today's diaspora of 9 million, still captive to the whims of unstable Gulf regimes. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Anabuddha and on Twitter at Ekaniseti. We'll see you next week.